So welcome to tonight's Tech Hour. It's Thursday the 20th of April and the title is Why Paper, Why Print, Why PDF, Why HTML? And this is going to be a sort of gallop through about 2,000 years of history. And the exciting things happen in the last 100 years, in the last 25 years. So the Chinese are one of the great ancient civilizations, and they built the Great Wall of China, although I don't remember when. And about 2,000 years ago, they started producing paper, essentially for administrative needs and cultural needs. So they had printed money, they used it for writing, and they also used it for drawing. And I think the tradition of Chinese and Japanese and Vietnamese and Korean calligraphy probably dates itself back to that sort of time. So that's all quite interesting. I guess when we talk about why paper, our focus is on writing, and in some sense we can go back even before, because before we were writing on paper, we were writing on stone and cuneiform tablets, and before that there was language, and before that there was song and dance. And when we're talking about song and dance, that's something that's shared with the animals, particularly the birds, I think. But about 2,000 years ago, we were civilized, living in our cities in China. We had central administrations, and paper developed. Now, about 1,000 years later, papermaking came to Europe. Previously, parchment was used, which was animal skins, I believe. And again, it was used for writing, and in particular for the Bible was one of the main written texts, and religious texts were important. If we continue with paper, around 1850, paper made out of wood pulp became a thing. Before that, it was made out of rags. It was an entirely different matter, but the cheap paper that's fit only for newspapers started coming out around 1850, and that really made things take off. And by the 1930s, there were newspapers in Britain. There were four men who owned about getting on for half the newspapers, and the daily circulation was about 13 million. I don't know if that means 13 million readers or 13 million copies. I know that when I was a child, we got a morning newspaper and an evening paper, and they were read by several people. So that was a 19th and 20th century thing, the newspapers. If you remember the best film ever, which was Orson Welles, what's the name of it? Xanadu. Was based upon the life of William Randolph Hearst, who was a newspaper magnate. So in a sense, that explains both why paper and why print. Print and paper are like automobiles and roads. There's not much point having a motorway, an interstate highway, if you don't have cars to drive on them. If you've got cars to drive, you need garages, mechanics, all sorts of things like that. A sort of diversion, but this is a worthwhile thing to remember, which was that the rise of the railway led to an increase in the use of horses. That might seem a bit odd, but with railways, you had much more freight of goods. Goods were transported, there was much more commerce, much more communication of goods. And when the goods arrived at their destination, railway station, they then had to be taken to the final customer. And that usually meant a horse and cart. So the railways actually became associated with stables, and the railways led to a rise in the use of horses. So something that struck me a lot when I read about it, and still strikes me quite strongly, is Martin Luther. Because I grew up thinking of the famous image of him writing his theses out on a piece of paper and nailing it to the door of the cathedral. And I thought, well, that's fantastic. But what I didn't realize was that these theses of Martin Luther were printed in thousands and thousands of copies. And that's what really made the difference. And the dissemination of information that print has provided is really extremely powerful. Now, if we take a century by century point of view, starting at about 1400s, you had Gutenberg printing the Bible in multiple copies, lowering the cost of production. In the 1500s, you had the rise of print, you had Aldus Manutius, Venetian printing, the existence of what might be called standard editions of works such as Dante's Inferno. In the 16th century, in the 1600s, you had Newton's works, which although not a big seller, were tremendously influential. You had Shakespeare's plays being published in the first folio edition. A lot of things happening along those lines. In the 1700s, you had the Enlightenment, you had people writing for a living, you had Voltaire, you had the Rights of Man, the French Revolution, the Declaration of Independence. In the 1800s, as I said, you had an industrial revolution, and print became very important for communication. One of the important print documents was the rules and regulations of the railway. The railway was a really big enterprise, and it required print in various forms, including timetables, in order to hold everything together. So if you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes, you'll know that he was never without his Bradshaw, which listed all the railway timetables in the United Kingdom. And I remember as a student in the 1970s at my university at the Porter's Lodge, it was a large university, they had a printed copy of the timetables for all the services. I don't think such things exist now. You go to a website and you get the timetables online. But when you don't have an internet, that's what you have to do. So print was a carrier, just as a cup is a carrier. A cup of tea isn't a cup of tea without the cup. But if the cup is empty, then there's nothing to drink. So print was used to carry information. Information was communicated by and large up to the 20th century by, just a moment, by putting it on a piece of paper and moving the piece of paper. And print was a means of producing multiple identical copies. So you had steam-driven rotary presses that would produce thousands of copies an hour. And these copies were printed overnight and arrived at people's houses in time for breakfast. That's what happened, certainly in my country and in my childhood. And all that happened because the information was being communicated by being put onto pieces of paper. The pieces of paper could be moved about, and the printing presses could produce thousands of identical copies very quickly. The modern equivalent, if you like, of a printing press is the server. And things like Cloudflare that can take thousands of visits to an important or interesting web page and communicate it on demand to the individuals that want it. That's quite interesting, that previously you'd get 300 copies of the newspaper dropped off at this station, 250 at that station, and so forth and so forth. And then it would be distributed to the news agents, and the news agents, the paper shops would distribute them to the individuals who subscribed to their particular newspaper. And there was a situation of returns where you could get refunds, where the news agent could get refunds for papers that weren't sold. So there was a large distribution network based upon the physical movement of paper. At the same time, there was an editorial process, and people such as typesetters and printers and designers and editors that created the masters, if you like, from which the identical copies were made. And that includes your traditional print workers. The 20th century is quite interesting. One of the two important things in the 19th century, and they're both British, I'm afraid. One was Faraday's discovery of electricity and his investigations, and in particular a prototype electric motor. There's a perhaps apocryphal conversation between Michael Faraday and William Gladstone, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer. And Gladstone said to Faraday, "What use is this electricity thing that you've demonstrated to us?" And Faraday says, "I know of no present use for it, sir, but I have no doubt that one day you will be taxing it." Put that to one side, electrical power started to replace electricity, started to replace steam. To begin with, it replaced gas and candles for illumination. And I happened by chance to read that around 1900, there were power stations that didn't produce power during the day. Their customers were all domestic, and they wanted the power for lighting in the morning and in the evening. But electrification made a big change. And the other thing that happened was the rise of radio, and with that, the rise of what we might call electronics, which would be radio valves and amplifiers and those sorts of things, which actually led to post office engineers, telecommunications, and the famous Colossus computer that was used to crack the Lorentz cipher during the Second World War. That was in Bletchley, which is about 3 miles from where I'm now sitting. And Alan Turing played a big role, not in the Enigma decoding, and William Tutt played a big role in the Lorentz decoding. That was built by post office engineers using standard post office equipment, including valves. So that was an outgrowth, if you like, of electricity and electric lamps and that sort of thing. In the 1950s onwards, we had transistors and miniaturization of transistors, and everything's getting smaller and cheaper. And you had printed circuit boards, and you had Moore's law, the whole recent sequence of events, which I hope I expect that many of you are fairly familiar with. And I'm going to finish this with a comparison that I found quite interesting, which is that if you think about what printed items you have about you on your person, you might have some money, you might have till receipts, bus tickets, all sorts of stuff like that. But actually your mobile phone also contains printing, because there's a process called photolithography, which is used for printing the, what's the word? You have these silicon wafers, and then you, so to speak, etch the you so to speak, use light to print the transistor, to create an image of the transistors that need to be appearing to make your CPU or memory or whatever it is, and then you chemically process them to make the whole thing work. So there's a whole process called photolithography, and Moore's law depends upon being able to produce finer and finer photolithography. And the world leader in this is a Dutch company called ASML. I think it just stands for ASML. They have a revenue of about $23 billion a year and 40,000 employees. And this is, of course, a business that has established itself in the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. For comparison, the Heidelberg Press Company, who are the leaders of printing presses, has a revenue of about $2 billion, $3 billion, and 12,000 employees. So the printing of memory chips and CPUs and GPUs and all that sort of thing has a rough parity, very rough parity, with the printing of pieces of paper. Now, in this context, let's think about PDF and HTML. Essentially, they represent two different cultures. One is, or two different routes, that might be better. When I say routes, I don't mean pathways. I mean, Jürgen has got a nice botanical drawing as his depiction, as his photograph. And what we don't see of the plant there is that there are roots to the plant, the roots from which it grows, the soil from which it grows. So the roots of PDF very clearly are the print tradition started by Gutenberg. I'd say that the roots of HTML are much more in the computing condition and the networking. So the roots of HTML are the works of Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, and that was based upon the electronic communication of information. At that time, which was the 1980s, academic and research institutions, of which CERN is a very important example, were leaders in network connectivity in the non-military world. And CERN has a lot of visitors and people, and the web started as a discovery mechanism for documents. So the two roots of PDF has its roots in print and books and Gutenberg, and HTML has its roots, if you like, in networks. So the HTML point of view is we communicate data, and it's up to the consumer what they do with it. The PDF point of view is approximately the same as the newspaper publisher, which is we produce identical copies, but instead of moving them on paper, we move them digitally. So it sort of makes sense to download data and only use bits and pieces of it to filter it, if you like. Whereas if you download a PDF, the only filtering you can do with it, more or less, is to say, oh, we're going to take a subset of the pages. And actually, with PDF, you can't make a request and say, well, I'm interested in your PDF document, but I only want these 3 pages. Can you just send me those 3 pages? PDF doesn't support that sort of functionality, whereas a website does support that functionality. You can say, here are 3 URLs, just download me these 3 URLs. And from the usability point of view, websites disapprove of, users disapprove of web pages that take more than 5 minutes to read. If it takes more than 5 minutes to read or more than 3 minutes to read, then you split it up into smaller pages. And the idea is that you have a page that you can read the start of it, scroll down it, scroll down it, scroll down it, and now you've got to the end. So the difference between PDF and HTML is in part different traditions, different cultures. So at that point, I think I'm going to pause because I'm going to run out of breath. And I hope that that will open the door for some participation.
So could I go on the end of the queue?
Sorry, Jason?
Could I be on the queue? Whoever's ahead of me could start, but I'd like to be on the queue.
Yeah, you speak. Off you go. Introduce
Oh.
yourself a bit if you want to.
So, Jason White, and yes, I suppose you might say I've been involved in accessibility with some interruptions for a long time. I did work at Educational Testing Service here in Princeton until mid last year in accessibility research and standards activities. And my background is in philosophy and also in law. So that's my essential position there. So let's see, let's go back to I suppose I have several questions to raise. And I think the first one, just as a side question, is the wood pulp paper post 1850s, as you noted earlier, does that disintegrate more rapidly than the pre-1850s materials? Because obviously, from an archival point of view, if we're going to lose post-1850s printed material more rapidly, then that's obviously going to be a concern. And of course, we have great concerns about the preservation of digital materials. So that was just a small point that I was interested in as I was listening to your historical development. And a related question to that, which I suppose starts to enter into some of the accessibility considerations, is what's happening to print usage these days? Is it declining in general among the literate population, in particular what's happening in the research community? So for example, younger scholars who grew up with online communication and digital documents, less likely to turn to printed material than those who grew up with it. I think that trend would be interesting to note, because that will influence, I suspect, what the technological trends turn out to be. And I don't know if you wanted me to speak to the accessibility issues briefly now, but I could certainly add a few comments on those.
Oh, please do, and more than briefly if you want.
All right, so you're exactly right that the PDF format, and as you know, it's I suppose, effectively a descendant of PostScript, and I remember using that back in the early to mid 90s. The format was revised to include aspects of the, I suppose you might call it, the SGML, XML, and HTML tradition, by including the ability to provide or to associate tags with aspects of the layout content. So there's a structural tree that can be included in the PDF file, and then it's linked with references to the streams of layout operators and text that are in the actual page descriptions. And if I remember correctly, those relationships are bidirectional. So you can go from the structural tree to the page layout, and from the page streams back to find out what the corresponding element is in the structure. And so that work was done. Adobe implemented it in their authoring and production tools, and also in their reading applications. There have been some other implementations on the production side. So some word processors, for instance, will produce the tagged PDF. But as far as I know, there've been very few implementations on the reading side, which is why, unless you're using Adobe's reading application in a Microsoft Windows environment, you might not even know as a screen reader user that the tags are present at all, let alone what their content is. So that's what's been going on in the PDF world. And I've read some references suggesting that as of PDF 2.0, there was interest in and some technology for reformatting the pages appropriately to different screen dimensions. So some of the fixed layout aspects of PDF may be diminished in importance in the future, depending on what direction that takes. But of course, HTML and EPUB and CSS styling have largely, obviously, they've dominated the web context in general, and also increasingly digital publishing. So I think they're important formats, and that's why, also bearing in mind their accessibility, including their accessibility to screen reader users, I think they're important for that purpose also, and should be considered an appropriate destination format for the publication of research output. But in addition to that, I think the some of the layout requirements, for instance, of people who use enlargement, and some of the recent requirements that have been introduced into web accessibility standards, and I'm thinking in particular of the requirement to prevent horizontal scrolling of content when it's enlarged, so that the reader can have it fit appropriately on screen when they're using a large font due to their disability-related needs. I think those kinds of conditions are more easily satisfied in HTML-based formats, and especially, and that's in addition to the needs of screen reader users that were discussed at the forum. I think the forum provided a very good overview of the state of the art, and the work that's being done by the LaTeX project is very interesting, and I'm sure we'll return to that. But that's probably enough of a monologue from me, that I'm responding largely to the historical development, and I'll gladly discuss some of the accessibility issues in greater detail later on.
I'm muting. Thank you very much for that, Jason. That was really very helpful. I have a few things that I could say, but I wonder if anybody else would like to come in at this point. I'll say something about archival printing and wood pulp, which is that, well, again, when I was a lad, old newspapers, you wouldn't throw them away. They were worth something. You could bundle them up and take them to the fish and chip shop, and then they'd be used to wrap up fish and chips, and then they'd be thrown away. There's a whole range of stuff that is called ephemera, that museum libraries such as the British Library are actually quite interested in, because they can be of great cultural significance. But the rise of wood pulp resulted over time with books that you buy to read on holiday, and then you leave them on the beach or you throw them away. The sort of anyway, there are a lot of books whose pages are deteriorating as time goes by because they're chemically unstable, and the Dover reprints a lot of books very nicely. I'm a very great fan of Dover publications, and they say we use acid-free paper so that they don't fall apart in that way. So that is a big problem, particularly if you're a librarian. And your question, Jason, about what's happening to print usage, it would be nice to have real statistics. and relevant statistics, and also what's happening with younger scholars, because they're growing up in different traditions. And however strongly I hold firm to the traditions of print, I know that however strongly I hold to those traditions, it won't stop me dying, and it won't stop somebody else coming to take my place. So the cultural transition of what is valuable in the print tradition to the next generation is, I think, very important. I'll stop at that point. Except to say one thing, maybe Carvy's got something to say.
Just a name at random, right?
Was this not a name, Carvey?
I was trying to think. I've actually been last 3 days. I've been at the London Book Fair, which finished today. I was trying to think of anything interesting or relevant there.
Were there any? How many people were there?
I don't know how many. Quite well attended, especially yesterday.
Thousands?
I really don't know. It must be thousands. Must be thousands. But it's a big place, and a lot of people come from abroad. Sorry, I haven't got anything specific to contribute. There's a lot of talk. There was a sort of parallel conference, and there was actually a lot of people. I had posted the archive accessibility forum to several people, and several had heard anyway, and they had 2 or 3 quite well-known people had, or not well-known, but senior people in publishing had attended. Or if they hadn't had any, they said they were going to look at them. So, for example, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, major publisher. And of course, Taylor and Francis had Stacey Scott, who was their accessibility officer, blind mathematician, which is wonderful. So I did, every time I spoke to the people especially in the production of books and journals, I emphasized the importance of accessibility when they're deciding how to process things, which vendor to send things to, etc. Of course, I have a vested interest. I believe that the best way to have accessibility is to have one compact, very structured form, what I call the format of record, which you then automatically convert to any form you want: HTML, PDF, EPUB, voice, Braille, automated ASL, etc. So that's what I believe. And unfortunately, that very, very simple thing, most people don't think of too much, because the main thing in publishers' minds is, anyone's mind is, what's the price and how quickly can I get it? How accurate is it? So you don't look in detail at the detail of, okay, for example, how was this HTML created? How was the PDF created? Which came first? So those are I think those are the details we should talk about. And just finally, just to say that I agree that HTML is absolutely the most important or the probably easiest format to read out or for accessibility, but it doesn't mean it's finished. What happens in 20 years' time after the web. We don't know what's coming next. Supposing something else comes along, we need a way to convert automatically. We don't want to go back and say, okay, guys, archive has now 3 million legacy documents. Now it's this new, whatever it is, we need to convert that. What's the best way to convert it? So we need to think ahead and be format agnostic.
I really like this term that you mentioned, Kaveh, the format of record. That sounds,
I'm
really
glad.
concept.
I've been shouting about this. I've got videos of my presentations. I said, yes, you talk about the version of record. Okay, this is if you go to the version of record, you want the HTML, PDF, XML. Okay, what if in 10 years' time someone says, hang on, this is X here on the PDF and Y on the HTML? Go to the publisher and say, well, which one is correct? The publisher needs to know. They should say, well, it's the PDF or the HTML or the XML. The other ones must be wrong. But most of them won't know because who knows? And the author, ask the author, sorry, author's gone. So that's simple.
The format of record goes back to the early days of print, because the bane of life before print was what's called copyist's error. Copyists would make errors, and even if your copyist didn't make an error, who's not to say that the original was the version from which the copyist was writing was correct. And even with print, you have that, because I think I remember correctly, the Shakespeare Folio, what would happen would be the amount of movable type available would be limited. So you set the type for certain pages, certain impressions, and you print them off. Do you see what I mean? And then when you've printed them off for the run of 500 or whatever it is, you redistribute the type and you print off the next collection of pages and so forth. And it might end up that you've got some blanks left, that you don't have enough pages or something. So you've got to print off another half dozen copies of a particular page to finish the book. So you've got to reset that page. So even with a printed book, in those sorts of conditions, you can have errors, just as with postage stamps, you occasionally have errors, the most famous of which is probably the upside down Flying Jenny from the United States, where they had a two-color design, which was a red frame and a blue aeroplane, biplane aeroplane in the middle. And the aeroplane was printed upside down on one sheet of stamps. And those stamp collectors collect them, and those stamps are worth about $200,000 each. But the question of the item of record is, in some sense, solved at a different level by using a version control system such as Git, which uses a effectively unforgeable checksum, and you can add to that digital signatures. So you can at least be sure that we've got identical copies, but which one is the right one is a different matter. But there's another version of this. Prior to that, there are legal deposit libraries, 4 of them in the British Isles, in Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and Cork, I think. And those libraries have a legal right to any book that is published in the United Kingdom, legal deposit libraries. And then you could say, well, T.S. Eliot's 4 Seasons, how can I be sure that I've got a copy that is identical to all the others? And you go to the British Library and you can compare it to the legal deposit copy in the British Library. I suppose the first legal deposit book was the famous Domesday book, which was record of taxable property in the United Kingdom was written for the taxman. I've stopped showing off my little knowledge of history and let Shamsi have another go at this.
Something that was coming to mind for me is one of the ideas that came up at the forum that was brought up by Raja Kushalnagar, who is a deaf academic. He was talking about the need for, he used a much more elegant term that I'm not remembering right now, but basically multimedia outputs, that you don't want to just output one thing in one way, but you want to output it in multiple ways because people ingest things in different ways and have different needs. So I was thinking about that flexibility. Now, it's a little bit ironic that if we had a format of record that we all agreed to, rather than locking us in and limiting our outputs, it would actually result in a great deal of flexibility, more flexibility.
Good point. Actually, I remembered. There's another. I do get excited about these things. There's again, I've got I came across the video exactly 10 years ago in 2013. There was a conference which went on, I think, 2 or 3 years. It was called Beyond the PDF. And it's now renamed to Force 11, which is actually running now or just finished yesterday. It's sort of alternatives to traditional publishing and beyond the PDF. But then after a while they thought, hang on, beyond the PDF means let's not throw it away. So they changed the name. We can have PDF and other things. But there, so my presentation there was called Publishers Give Us the XML, which I'm still shouting about. For example, if you go to certain publishers, even the open access, which the authors paid, maybe several thousands to be published, you can get the PDF HTML, not the XML. And funny enough, all publishers, they specify that to vendors like us, that it should be XML first. Your production is XML first. Produce XML. From that, produce everything else. Now, what I said was, guys, please don't hide the XML. Give us the XML. And in fact, why don't you give us the XML and nothing else? Just the XML. Your job is done. You've peer reviewed the content. You've created the format of record, if you like. You've tagged this. It's geeky. It's unreadable. But allow third parties to go in and take that and render it in whichever way they like, so that we are not locked into this double column PDF, which is very difficult to read on screen, for example. Or if I'm a dyslexic, I should be able to say, produce a PDF with dyslexic font, which is available. So, why? So that's even going further. Just give us the XML and nothing else. So you don't have to spend money on that. There'll be lots of third parties who will charge a bit of money to say, we'll create this for you. And just for fun on the screen, I'll send you the link if you like. But I did a live demo, where I took the XML, pressed the button, we got a double column PDF, pressed another button, we got a double column PDF, this time with numerical references instead of author year, because that's what I prefer. And you can do that on the fly. You're not locked into that. Pressed another button, and I got every other word was gray, black, gray, because I might have some sort of limitation where I have to see where the next word is. And then just for fun, I said, how about this? I randomly rotated each word, but it was perfectly typeset. Everyone started laughing. I said, well, it's not your business. That is my fault. What was it? That's my house. Yes, it was. I said, this is my house style. I don't want your house style. So I got a few laughs as well. But you're absolutely right, Shamsi, that give us that really good XML that you absolutely, make sure that's absolutely correct, and let anyone come in and maybe mix and match. Take a paragraph from here to, mix it with something else.
Audio now unmuted. Audio now muted.
I'd just like to add to the queue if I could, but after everyone else, yeah.
No, you're on, Jason.
Audio now muted.
Right, am I there? We're right.
Yeah, please continue. We're listening, and I'm really keen to see what your view is, Jason.
So this is interesting. So I remember that there was a paper published, I think it was in the early 2000s by Mays and Rahman, and this observation may have been well known before that, but that's certainly where I read it. And they noted the fact that if you're trying to convert M source formats to N destination formats, and they're all independent, then you have to multiply the number of conversions that you need to implement. But if you have an intermediate format that is common, then you only need to define M conversions to the intermediate format and N conversions to all of your output formats. And that's obviously a lesser number of conversions that need to be implemented overall. So I think the argument for the intermediate format is that the implementation is easier and it's more tractable. You don't have to multiply the number of conversions that you have to create. So quite independently of the format of record, I think there's an argument for it. It also seems to me that the publisher's situation is rather different from my situation as an author, but there are relationships. So obviously in a publisher's context, they're likely to receive a range of different input formats, and for the reasons that have been brought to the fore today, there's a good argument for saying that they should have an intermediate format into which all of those are converted and out of which all of the various outputs are generated automatically. From an author's perspective, if I'm writing a paper, then there's only one input format, but I may very well want to generate multiple output formats. And as was highlighted at the forum, it's important to support this situation because my reviewers and others or colleagues or others with whom I might want to share it before it goes through the submission process might very well want to read it, and they could very well have disabilities. So we need to be able to support the same kinds of conversions in my system as an author that the publisher would want to support for accessibility reasons as well. So I think if we could support both of those types of use cases, then we'd be in a much better position than we are now. And if we can share technologies, that would be even better.
If I may, this is Kaveh again. So I didn't quite get on your first point. Absolutely, that make one intermediate format, and then from then you can make any other format. The irony is that we already have that single format. It's XML, and it's almost always JATS XML. That is the standard for scholarly publishing. And every single vendor has to take anything that comes in, Word or LaTeX or anything else. They have to convert it automatically, semi-automatically, manually, in any way. So we are already there. Every publisher demands that, and then they demand different, house style for PDF, etc. So we don't even have to do anything. But again, the irony is that intermediate format is normally either not available or not easily available, and no one's doing anything with it. People are just looking at the PDF or HTML.
So when I was dealing with the page proofs of a book chapter manuscript, I'm reasonably certain from comments that I received during the process that the publisher had it in an XML format. And after some discussions with their accessibility group, instead of giving it to me in a not very accessible PDF file, they were eventually able to give it to me in HTML. Then I was able to use that to try to look for errors, which there were and which were duly corrected, and they were very thorough in that process, and that's commendable. But I don't know whether they would have given me the XML if I'd asked for it. It would have been, I could have taken that into an XML editor or just a text editor that has XML validation capabilities, and I certainly have that, and I could have corrected it directly from the XML and sent it back, which would have saved a whole lot of time and trouble. So that's just one anecdote. Maybe as an author, maybe I should be thinking about writing in DocBook or some other XML-based format. I know ASCII Doc is interesting because it's on the surface, it's a markup language that looks simple and which is very concise for authoring, a little like Markdown, but there's a mapping between ASCII Doc and DocBook 5 XML. So it's an author-friendly format, if you like, which is designed to go straight to a well-known XML document type for later processing. So, I mean, one possibility from an author's point of view to make things easier on the accessibility side, both for oneself and for others, would be to move towards those kinds of formats. And that's something to think about. And then of course, the question is what tools to use and whether all the freely available tools that one can download are all going to produce the right quality of output and so on, and whether one's needs as an author can be satisfied. But I think doing that would make sense from my point of view, and probably from the point of view of quite a number of other people who are, shall we say, technically inclined and who are writing material anyway. And I know there are people who write technical documentation professionally, and that they use XML directly, or they use one of the Markdown or ASCII Doc or related formats anyway. So I think, yes, if we could support the author's use cases and the publisher's use cases, and to the extent that we could share the technologies, that could be a move in the right direction. I probably said too much, but I hope it helps.
This discussion makes me very curious what the barriers are that people have experienced to what feels like a very practical and straightforward shift towards a shared format. I actually have to run to another meeting. This has been really interesting. Thank you again to Jonathan for this venue.
And thank you again for the forum, Shams. It was a really great experience.
Thanks so much for participating.
Yeah, we all thank you. I thank you.
And I did too.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate the coordination and the sharing.
Thank you so much, everybody. All right, I'm going to run.
All right, then. This would be a good time for anybody else that doesn't want to stay to quietly leave. And after that, people can stay and continue to talk as long as they want, within reason, and we're still being recorded. Kelly, did you get to the forum, or are you waiting for the videos? Okay. Okay.
Interesting to see sorry. I was thinking about, David put that note about HTML, which is
Yeah.
fair enough. I mean, making archive accessible, it's probably you're taking the most difficult problem for accessibility for various reasons, but we can do anything. One thing it's not clear for me still is how accessible. I think archive are doing tests now. How accessible is the current R5 conversion? Know anything about that?
Oh, well, it's too bad ShamGS left the meeting. Basically, she's done a lot of interviews, and I think the majority of respondents have said that they prefer HTML over PDF.
Sure.
So we're kind of taking that as our guide. Our initial goal is to get things into HTML, and then I hope that we will start to enhance that to make it more accessible. So basically somehow evaluate the accessibility of what we're generating and then try to improve it. And working with the 2 million articles, we're dealing with trying to automatically enhance the existing HTML. Whereas for new submissions, we're going to provide guides for how to create better, more accessible articles from the get-go, which will make our lives much easier. So I think a lot of this is going to, start to happen towards the end of the year, probably. I mean, we need to get it out there first, then we need to start the sort of feedback loop and start improving it. And, hopefully in a few years, we'll refine it. But I put that note in the chat about the format of record because I'm like, for the perfectionists, this is like, this HTML is some of it's, it goes from pretty good, to some of it doesn't translate too well. And so
no, that doesn't apply to the format of record is actually only for going forward. So and publishers now, the fact that they actually say we want XML first, you would think, sure, yeah, XML must be it, because otherwise, how could the PDF be right and the XML wrong? So that wouldn't apply to yourselves. You've got the toughest problem. But what I was thinking was, and I agree that we need HTML. So is the plan to keep the current HTML the way that it or is there a possibility of regenerating with a new kind of, or have we not even got there yet?
I'm not sure how much I can say, but the idea, these tools are evolving. So, the LaTeX ML folks are continually, working. I think they're rewriting a good portion of it in Rust. I could see, regenerating the HTML, and I believe R5 does it every year. They regenerate the entire collection, which I think is great because they make a bunch of improvements, release a new version of LaTeX ML, and then they just rerun it across the system. And so that's kind of.
I have to say they've done an amazing job. I didn't get a chance to congratulate Dejan on what they've done quietly in the background. Hundreds of thousands. Or over 1 million documents converted. It's superb. But what I was thinking was, there's a possibility of, if we were thinking afresh, if you're converting something to HTML, it's not more difficult to convert to XML first. And then from that XML convert to HTML, because then you get rid of file that you keep is much leaner, it's simpler, and it's almost readable without any styling. The test is to actually look behind the scenes. So look at the code. So if you see an HTML page, look at the code. Is it simple? How readable is the actual HTML with the tags? That gives an idea of how lean it is and how it'll convert to new formats in future that come out. So that, I'm just thinking aloud. I have some ideas, but there's a lot to think about.
So I haven't looked at the intermediate format that LaTeX ML produces. I did try it during the last week on several of my own documents, and I had a relatively simple document which it converted to HTML immediately, and then I tried it on a paper of mine and it ran, but it didn't run to completion. It just kept running without completing its output. So I don't know what was responsible to that. I do wonder whether the bibliography might have been the problem, but it's certainly, if they're planning to implement a new version, then I'd certainly be interested in testing it and seeing if they can do any better on the kinds of documents that I've been writing.
Yeah, there's also Tech for HT. I'm not sure if you've tried that. I mean,
Yes,
I'm one. I like to try different tools. So if there's another tool, you could see if that does any better.
I've no doubt that the archive is doing the right thing by making the R5 HTML available, because it's largely comprehensive. It exists. It has definite value, even though it definitely has value, the precise amount of value it has is unknown, but that doesn't matter. And it will start the process going, at the very least. The archive is open, so anybody, including myself, can download any papers I'm interested in, convert them to XML or whatever I want, and publish them. And the archive is at present adopting a model where you upload the text source and the figures, and it does the conversion to the PDF, and it does the conversion to HTML going forward. But one could easily imagine a different sort of archive whereby the stuff is uploaded and it has no responsibility for the rendering. And a secondary archive whereby the documents are rendered to HTML in a form that allows for annotation and interaction amongst readers, a community version of the archive, a social version of the archive. It's certainly quite imaginable, and I could see it getting funding in certain circumstances. That was one of the questions that Charles Frankston answered in his closing remarks, is we're not going to do that, but other people can. So to a certain extent, the archive can just say no, and it's not a no, you're not going to do this. It's no, we're not going to do that, but you can if you want to.
Yeah, there are a lot of labs projects associated with the archive, and the R5 came in as a lab project, and we basically are moving it into the mainstream production system. So, I mean, in terms of other organizations kind of doing this, I mean, I think there are some licensing and permission issues in terms of taking the content and basically putting it up somewhere else. But But I
I
think
can't imagine them being unreasonable and restrictive.
some authors do.
Oh, well, if the authors don't agree, yeah, if the authors.
I mean,
says-
some of them, if they find their paper somewhere else, they're like, why is why is my paper, somewhere else?
Do you know what the license is? What's the copyright license is on archive? I don't know offhand.
I think the newer licenses are much more generous.
Okay, yeah.
in terms of what you can. I think the older
Obviously,
license,
30 years ago, we didn't have CC BY, for example.
right. Some of the older license, I think, basically just gives archive the permission to display the articles. So that's, I mean, it likely won't be an issue. I mean, but I just wanted to kind of
That's a good point.
comment on it.
Well, even if the world isn't ideal, we can make the best of what there is. I mean, as long as we make as long as we're trying to make the best of what there
Right.
is.
Yes, I think we're making this effort with HTML because I think it's not that difficult. I mean, we sort of have the mechanisms in place where we can do these conversions. So we basically just add another conversion that generates the HTML, and that's relatively straightforward. I think the challenge will be in the future in correcting the HTML. I mean, so, with the PDF, oh, there's a problem. Okay, I go in, edit the text source, and I fix the problem, and it's fixed. But there's less control over this sort of flawed kind of conversion to HTML, where when there are issues, it's a little more challenging to actually address them. So that's why we talk about the regeneration potentially. As issues are resolved, we may end up, regenerating the HTML. So.
But that's part of the reason I was thinking of converting to. I mean, HTML is a display format. It's designed to be looked at. It's not strict, and browsers have always they've competed to be as lenient as possible, so that if you've got a tag missing, it'll guess what it is. So it's in a way it's the worst thing to have as an absolute format. And that's why I was thinking if there may be a way, if there is, it is possible to go something like not quite take for HT, but maybe a similar kind of system where you convert the tech into XML. You may have 10, 50, 20 different workflows, if you like, and you try, and each file will work with one of them. Once you've done that, then you're sort of on a solid ground, because that becomes, if you like, your version of record. Then you can turn it to HTML. And if future something comes up, you don't have to go into this really ugly HTML, verbose HTML file and say, what the heck do I do now? For example, this equation is being given in 5 different forms. Which one is it? Which is the most likely? That becomes more of an issue then for future conversion.
Right.
So
yeah. So when you go to the archive, when you click on get the source, you'd like to see, text source, XML, HTML, PDF. I mean, like you'd have this other option. And I thought the LaTeX project was actually targeting some kind of XML intermediate format, right? Is that correct?
The LaTeX project.
Or am I?
Not especially. I mean,
No. Okay.
No, I think they're looking at making tag. I mean, again, a very difficult problem. Fully tagged PDF. And I'm guessing then I can't speak for them, but it's primarily looking at making fully accessible PDF, which is a bigger problem. Again, my problem there is, I mean, you had the cleverest LaTeX guys, the tech guys, Frank Mittelbox and others. But even once we've got that fantastic tag PDF. If all the effort goes there, then you're locked into PDF. What if I've got something else in 10 years' time? I don't want to have to go and, grab these out of the PDF again. PDF is not the best place you want to grab these out of. That's what I feel.
Jason.
So there's already a standard for conversion from tagged PDF to HTML, and I'm not aware of any readily available implementation, although there might be one around somewhere. One could just as well go from tagged PDF to an XML format. Obviously, you'll only get whatever information is present in the tags and in the textual content. And I assume you could extract the images as well. So you would get images and a marked up XML document with whatever the text happens to be included. So and that's certainly a route that could be taken for whatever purposes one might be interested in. Unfortunately, as far as I know, we don't have readily available conversion tools for that. The other side to it, of course, is that various publishers must have their own infrastructure for converting text source into whatever their internal XML formats are. And my suspicion is that, and I don't know this for sure because I'm not in contact with those kinds of people, but my suspicion is that everyone's doing it in their own unique way, and that's probably unfortunate.
I think the conversion is
can
largely done by typesetting suppliers.
Yeah, so I'm in that space, Jason. In general, publishers outsource. In the old days, they used to do a lot of things in-house. And of course, I remember when Cambridge University Press, the oldest scholarly publisher, had literally a press. They actually printed and shipped out the books and journals from the building in Cambridge. But over the years, they've sent it out to suppliers. And over the last, say, 20 years or 25 years, as offshore vendors have come along, prices have gone down. So everything, more and more is being outsourced. So typically, when a LaTeX file comes in, a journal of combinatorics or something will be done by a particular supplier, and they know what the style is, what the copy editing style is, what the XML DTD is, what the PDF style is. They get everything that the author is given. It's dumped to them on an FTP site. They have typically a week or 2 weeks to do all that's necessary and then give back what we call the deliverables, which is XML, PDF, maybe HTML, figures separately. That's it. So it's up to the supplier. They can do whatever they like. Some of them are highly automated. Some of them are automated and manual. There'll be some manual checking in all cases. So there is virtually nothing is done by publishers themselves.
So if the suppliers are smart, they will automate that as much as they can and do whatever checking is needed and correct the results, I would imagine.
Absolutely, yes. And we are suppliers. We are small suppliers because we're not primarily, as typesetters, if you like. But that's what we do. We automate as much as we can, and we so that we reduce the checking. Yeah, and it's the more you do, the more the more money you make, basically.
Right. So if you had let's assume that in the next year or so, if I remember the forum correctly, that they're expecting to have some tagged PDF support in the coming months for at least a certain cases, for certain types of documents. So if you were able to convert that to XML from the tagged PDF or from some intermediary, as we were discussing last week, then that would be an alternative conversion method. And if that becomes reliable, then it might be better than most of the other conversion methods out there if it gains adherence within the tech community among package authors, for example. So yeah, that could really, that LaTeX project on tagging could really change the conversion situation quite significantly in the next several years.
If
Sorry,
it
go on.
works. If it works.
Yeah, exactly. It has to work, and the client is very specific, and we can't say, well, this didn't work because this particular package was that. They just want it done. So the buck stops with the with the vendor. I don't know. My feeling is that is not. I wouldn't go that route, because you're sort of going long-winded. You're sort of putting the spoon, in your mouth, whatever it is, putting your arm around your head, neck. For me, converting from LaTeX direct to XML is a it's a simpler process, and a lot of suppliers already have that. So actually, I believe creating tag PDF is a big problem, is a bigger problem than we think, because the limitations of PDF. So it's just my hunch that, and the other thing is, you don't want to be dependent on that. Yeah.
There's a French psychologist, teacher of Freud, amongst other people, Charcot. And he said that theory is fine, but it doesn't prevent things from existing. And it also doesn't ensure that things exist. So the theory says it will work, but we just don't know. Theory is important when it acts as a useful guide to action. But if there are no operational consequences of the theory, then it's not so important. And to me right now, it doesn't matter. Oh, bye, David. Thanks for coming. For me, it doesn't much matter whether the archive HTML is 30% good or 60% good or 80% good. It is good enough to be usefully produced and made available, and it's not good enough that we need to stop looking at alternative solutions and improving existing solutions. It's quite helpful. The advice I give myself is, what's my special responsibility in this situation because of where I am and who I am, and that sort of thing. What's my special responsibility? And the other thing is, by working together, we can make things better.